From the horrific abuse she endured in her childhood to the Hollywood treatment she's getting after her prison stint, here's why some people are wondering if Gypsy Rose Blanchard is a victim or a villain. In case you don't know, Gypsy experienced unimaginable abuse while she was a kid. And I'm not just talking about the odd smack when she acted up. What Gypsy went through is like something out of a horror movie. It's important to know the details, so let me fill you in real quick. For starters, her mother, Claudine Blanchard, or Dee Dee, had a syndrome known as Munchausen by proxy. This mental disorder makes caregivers diagnose illnesses to ensure they can keep people dependent on them. In Gypsy's case, her mom had a serious case of the syndrome, which resulted in decades of her being told she was sick. By the time she was 7 or 8 years old, Dee Dee had convinced her that she needed a wheelchair to get around, claiming that she had some form of muscular dystrophy. Now you're probably wondering why she'd do something like this, right? Honestly, it was just for money and attention. I mean, if I see someone with a chronically ill child, that person will have my complete sympathy. In fact, I would go out of my way to assist the parent in any way I could, and this is exactly the type of treatment that Dee Dee had grown accustomed to. In 2001, Gypsy was crowned the honorary queen of a Mardi Gras crew, and y'all can probably tell how much her so-called illnesses factored into that. Money was also a major factor, because the government is always willing to step in and lend struggling parents a helping hand. Dee Dee got government assistance, which helped her pay the bills, and a bunch of charities like the Make-A-Wish Foundation and Habitat for Humanity helped her out too. She wasn't going to let her meal ticket slip through her fingers, so she took Gypsy out of school when she was in the 2nd grade. In her view, her daughter was just too sick to attend normal school, so she decided to homeschool her instead. Gypsy might not even have learned how to read if it hadn't been for the Harry Potter books she found lying around. She had to teach herself this basic skill, all while her mom was taking her body apart piece by piece. I know that sounds horrible, but it's the truth. Dee Dee put her child through all sorts of torment, like having her saliva glands removed to stop her from drooling. And do you want to know the worst part? Gypsy was only drooling because her own mother was numbing her gums before doctor's appointments. The whole thing was fabricated, and the medications Gypsy was taking had their own terrible side effects. At some point, the kid started to lose her teeth due to the anti-seizure medication she was taking. It's kind of a miracle that she survived such a toxic childhood. She was hardly ever allowed to experience the real world. She didn't even know her own age. But in 2012, everything changed. That's when she met Nicholas Godejohn, aka the man who'd eventually take her mother's life. They first started talking through a Christian singles website, and Gypsy began telling him all about her tragic life. She had a pretty good idea that her mom was lying about her illnesses by this point, and she'd tried to make a run for it just a year prior. So she was glad to finally have someone to confide in. They were around the same age too, so the relationship had the potential to be healthy. And a year after they met, Gypsy came up with a ruse to meet him in person. They pretended to bump into each other at a movie theater for the first time, and according to Nick, Gypsy led him to the bathroom to have sex pretty much as soon as they met. Not long after that, they began plotting her mother's demise. In June of 2015, Gypsy's boyfriend stabbed her mom 17 times while she was sleeping. The guy was clearly seeing red while committing the crime, and to make things worse, Gypsy helped him into the house while her mother was out cold. Like, she literally gave him the homicide weapon for Pete's sake, so she definitely had an active role in the sordid events that followed. After handing Nick a knife, a roll of duct tape, and some gloves, Gypsy hid in the bathroom, waited for him to do the deed, and covered her ears to block out her mom's blood-curdling screams. Once the deed was done, the two were intimate before stealing about $4,000 in cash and holding up in a motel to plot their next move. They were caught on multiple security tapes in the aftermath, so when police finally found Dee Dee's corpse, it wasn't difficult to put the pieces together. In the end, Nicholas Godejohn was sentenced to life in prison for first-degree homicide, whereas Gypsy was given a 10-year sentence after pleading guilty to second-degree homicide. Here's where things start to get really complicated. Gypsy was released in December of 2023 after serving 8 years, and she's riding a massive wave of support. Don't get me wrong, what happened to Gypsy was straight up awful, and she deserves all the sympathy we can give her for that, but you can't just ignore what she did. Gypsy's become a bit of a celebrity after being released, and in my opinion, that's kind of weird, to put it mildly. She started to become famous during her trial, and in 2019, she even became the subject of a Hulu miniseries called The Act. The show featured Patricia Arquette playing her mother, and it brought even more attention to the dreadful saga that culminated in Dee Dee's death. Now that she's out of prison, she's hit the interview circuit to tell her side of the story, and much of the response has been extremely biased in her favor. I'm not saying we should turn her into a villain, but again, this isn't a black and white situation. The evidence in the trial clearly showed that Gypsy was culpable for her mother's death. Some would argue that Dee Dee deserved to die, but I'm not going to get into that debate. My point is this: Gypsy chose to take her mother's life in cold blood, and she really didn't have to go that far. Sure, her mom was indisputably the villain of her story, but since when does that justify homicide? Gypsy was able to meet her boyfriend and plan a capital crime. So what was stopping her and Nick from just going to the police? They could have reported the abuse and done everything by the book, and there were quite a few doctors that would have supported her. A pediatric neurologist named Bernardo Flasterstein had already refuted the muscular dystrophy claims, along with suspecting that Dee Dee had Munchausen by proxy. What's more, an anonymous caller told police that Dee Dee was forging Gypsy's birth records and potentially using a fake identity herself. Gypsy could have used all of that to her advantage. She could have followed the law and made her escape without getting involved in something so brutal. But instead, she decided that getting her boyfriend to stab her mom 17 times was the better solution. And do you want to know what really rubs me the wrong way? Gypsy fell in love with someone else while she was in prison. She basically left Nick behind as soon as they received their sentences. And when she's asked about it in interviews, she doesn't seem to recognize what he's going through. The way she sees it, she did her time and he's doing his, and she wishes him well on his journey, whatever that means. Her statements are coming in at a pretty important time in her life. Gypsy's getting a major Hollywood rebrand after her release, and that really doesn't sit well with me. She's a convicted criminal who's showing zero remorse, but the media is trying to depict her new romance as some kind of happily ever after, all while her former lover rots away for a crime she helped commit. By the looks of it, people are being far too lenient with Gypsy, and they're ignoring the obvious signs that something dark is lurking under the surface. Trauma tends to leave behind scars that can last a lifetime, but no one wants to hear that now, do they? They just want a feel-good story about a girl who escaped her abuse and is now getting the life she deserves. The reality is, Gypsy might not be a bad person, but that doesn't mean she's a good person either. Like, she was intimate with her boyfriend right after he killed her mom. Who does that? At the very least, the seriousness of what she's done clearly hasn't sunken in yet, and all the glorification might lead to some dangerous consequences down the line. So from her Hollywood rebrand following her prison stint to the horrific abuse that defined her childhood, this was everything you needed to know about Gypsy Rose Blanchard.